I'm so excited to be speaking to a person who just pops off the screen when you read his words. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to just say who you are, and then I'm going to kind of let you add some flavor to this, right? So I'm speaking to Frank Velasquez Jr., who is a keynote speaker, a storyteller, social justice warrior, a community-centered guru, creator, ascending leader in color, a hornet nest stirrer. I mean, come on, who describes himself as a hornet nest stirrer? I love it. Always striving to be his authentic self in spaces he occupies. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Rebecca.
You're very welcome. And you are the founder of the organization For the Hood, right?
I am. Yes, I am.
So we're going to hear a bit more about that. But just tell the listeners where you're speaking from today.
Oh, yeah. So I'm in southern Arizona, so Tucson, Arizona. The Sonoran Desert is what we're known for. Beautiful place, but yeah, right now it's about 5 o'clock in the morning, and it is a little bit nippy, at least for southern Arizonans. Are like, oh my gosh, it's a little cold today, but
Yeah.
love being here. It's been a great. It's Tucson the last few weeks has been a really nice. We're waiting for the hot weather, which is what we're also known for. So I'm taking the
Yeah.
cold as long as we get it.
Yeah, I was quite surprised to see you with your hat on and for you to say it's cold because whenever I've heard of Arizona, I hear of desert and heat. Clearly, for those of you
Yes.
who are listening, he has a woolly hat. He has a hat on, which I wasn't expecting. But yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us at 5 a.m. in the morning. You know, I know it's no easy feat, so I really appreciate that. We're going to jump straight in there because, as we know, as you for regular listeners, we know we get straight in there, right? So. We hear a lot over here about the political climate. We know, gosh, conversations about racial justice seem to be forever in the news. There's an election coming up this year, which is again stoked fires. So I'm just wondering, how how are other minorities, particularly ethnic minorities, faring in this current political climate?
That's a really good question. I think it has been very polarizing for sure, and I think for people who look like me, um, I feel like it's almost like we're coming to a head here. And I'm going to give you an example. So so Florida, which is one of the 50 states in the U.S., their governor basically eliminated DEI programs,
Yeah.
and so that is an affront to people who look like me, and
And
it's
can I
and
just
it's
jump
because
in and just say DEI, I mean, I know most of you are listening will know what that is, but just for those who may not know, can you just
yes,
explain?
diversity, equity, and inclusion. And A is usually added in there as well for accessibility. Um, so, so those programs in that state, which I actually used to live in, have been eliminated, and so it's becoming more tense, and it's definitely a time where a lot of reflection has to happen. And
Yeah.
so anyway, so in my state, fortunately, we do have um, a governor who's Democratic. Our Senate, though, is still, I think it still leans Republican. And,
Mm.
even just using those terms, sometimes it's difficult because I really do wish that, what is what is, meaning in the sense of like, let's just acknowledge our history, let's
Yeah.
acknowledge our past so that we can move forward in a great way. And for a lot of white folks in the US, that's a trigger. That's a trigger for them. I don't know if it's because it's being shameful of the events of the past and the history of America,
Yeah.
but a simple acknowledgement would really go a long way.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of similar to what's happening here in a way, but I suppose, whilst tensions are rising, I can imagine they're not as fraught as they are in the States just yet, thankfully, I think. But even just to say the word white, sometimes that can be triggering just because for a lot of white people, they aren't used to having to talk about their own race. And can I again just ask, if you do not mind me asking, and if you do, you can tell me. Can you just explain how you describe yourself on a ethnic or cultural level,
Sure.
just suppose for people who are listening and watching?
Sure, absolutely. So I kind of bounce back and forth between just saying Mexican because that is my ethnicity, or just saying brown. So if I talk in a broader context, I'll usually call myself a brown man, but I am Mexican, and so that is even a journey with how people who look like me have been identified. You know, in the past it was Hispanic, or still is in a lot of ways Hispanic slash Latino. I don't
Yeah.
really call myself either. I just call myself from the country that I'm from, or
Yeah.
where my family lineage is from. But yeah, even that has been really interesting. Or I'll even add this, Rebecca.
Mm.
Um, I uh, Hispanic slash Latino has been called an ethnicity, not a race. And I
Yeah.
believe both are constructs, obviously. But anytime I had to check the box where it said white but Hispanic, I would never check white because I don't get, and again, in America, I don't
Mm.
get any advantages of a white person. And so I
Wow.
would never mark that. And some places now don't make that distinction. It'll just say race slash ethnicity. But growing
Yeah.
up, for sure, that was my option. Was I couldn't say I was Hispanic as if it was a race, but I was white Hispanic, which never made sense to me.
Wow, that's so it's so interesting, these forms and even the order in which, you
Yep.
know, the ethnicities are placed. But that's a whole other conversation. It does make me think about when I was in Puerto Rico last year, I think it was. And again, I was reading an article about a similar sort of thing where a lot of Puerto Ricans will say they're Puerto Rican, but
Yep.
not and but be quicker to identify with white than any other, you know, description of ethnicity, which
Yeah.
causes a whole load of problems.
Absolutely. And there's like 24 subgroups of what Hispanic slash Latino is. So yeah, so
Mm,
we will identify ourselves from our country, Mexican, Puerto Rican,
yeah,
Ecuadorian, et cetera, et cetera. So yep,
yeah. All in
that is a
education.
thing.
Yeah. So you run the organization for the Hood. Can you explain to the listeners what that's all about?
Yes, so that is it's a great labor of love. So I started this
Mm,
just over a year ago. And the way I describe what For the Hood does is I say we craft organizational stories and help leaders authentically tell their own. And so from the former, I have this methodology where I tell an organization story using story arc. So if you think about like a storybook, the
mm,
5 stages of story arc, if I write it in that way, it comes alive, the story does. But I
mm,
got to tell you, the latter is what I really have just taken off with.
mm,
Helping leaders authentically tell their own stories is primarily for people of color, people who look like us.
mm,
Um, through the course of, and I do it mainly. I don't want to say I do it mainly because it does bleed into the personal life, but it starts in the workplace because we
mm.
spend a great deal of our time in the workplace.
Yeah.
We have to fit into a space that was never designed for us. And I'm talking
Right.
about people of color. So
Yeah.
how do you reclaim? I call it the 3 R's. How do we reclaim? Well, let me just tell you what the 3 R's
Mm,
are. I've created a space called Ascending Leaders in Color. And in that space, it's a space where we can authentically be real with one
mm-hmm.
another. It's a
Yeah.
space where we can reconnect with each
Oh, I like
other
that.
as people
Yeah.
of color.
Yeah.
And then the last part I think is the most important. It's a space where we can reclaim every part of who we are, uh, because we've had to take pieces away just to fit into the space that was never designed for us.
I
So that's the
love
reclamation
that.
part.
Yeah, I'm just wondering
Yeah.
how that we acknowledge that these systems weren't set up for us, right? They are systemically racist. So how do you do that how do you reclaim a space
You
that
know,
wasn't
and
reclaimed? Yeah, go ahead.
here's the thing. No, I love it. I've never promised, let me just talk a little bit about the outcomes. I never promise that we will become fully authentic in the spaces that we occupy by going through my program, because it's a
Yeah.
lie. That
Yeah.
that is a lie. But the goal is to get closer and closer to that authenticity, because it absolutely is going to help us lead better with authenticity and joy.
Oh,
So that is always the goal, is like just inching ourselves closer to that space where we feel confident, where we self advocate. You know,
yes.
I can share like a handful of stories because this program only started last May, and I've had
Yeah.
2 pilots completed,
Yeah.
and some of the feedback coming through has been exactly that. They find themselves advocating more for themselves than they had before.
I really love that because, you know, a question I've had a few times here is, can ethnic minorities not get to the point where they feel authentic. Usually a white person's asked that question. And, I guess that's coming from a place where they see it so wrong, which it is so wrong that you cannot go to a workplace and be your authentic self. But I think if you've never been able to be genuine, I think it's hard to explain why that is and how that shows up. And I
Yeah.
think that it's the reason why we code switch. It's the reason why we feel the need
Yes.
to relate. It's the reason why we
Absolutely.
can't use our usual dialect or use the words that we use because we feel we're going to be judged. It's a form of protection, right? And so I just
Absolutely.
think it's such a brave thing for you to broach or to try and get closer. And I love your honesty about that. You're never currently in the systems that we have, we're not going to get there 100%. To even try and get there. And what you said was, you get to be real, you get to reconnect, you get to reclaim, or at least nearly bits.
Yeah.
Because I think far too often we don't try because we don't know there's an alternative. So
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, it's great to hear that people have gone through the program and have felt closer to that sense of reconnection and being real and reclaiming.
Yeah. Well, I will add, thank you, Rebecca. I will add that some of the feedback that also came out from the two pilots
Mm.
was that there wasn't this automatic, you didn't have to have that experience. Like some of the topics I go over are like microaggressions,
Mm.
code switching you mentioned, the
Mm.
bias of professionalism, the effects of assimilation. So not everybody had that same experience. And I should have
Mm.
shared this as well. I keep the groups small. We only
Mm.
have 10 people per group because
Right.
to me that creates the intimacy of the
Yes.
conversation. And so the what was happening is some people would be like, I didn't go through that, but they're listening to nine other people of an experience that they did go through. So
Mm.
to me, I think another benefit of the program was there was never an expectation of that everybody was going through the same experience. We all have
Mm.
different journeys, but I think the side benefit of what ends up occurring is that because now you're listening to somebody who is sharing their story, it builds your own empathy. And I think that was
Yes.
one of the things that I wasn't expecting was that
Yeah.
people I think maybe I did think that everybody was going to have some element of the same experience,
Mm.
but they did. Some were insulated. Some were really questioning their upbringing, like, "Oh my gosh, have I assimilated? And I didn't even know that I was assimilating."
Oh my
Seeing those
gosh.
moments, yeah, they're just like their brains were like exploding.
Again, another amazing point because I find that often in training, sometimes I feel like, oh my gosh, have I just burst that person's bubble? Just by just explaining what racism truly is and how it presents itself. And you can see people questioning exactly asking the same sorts of questions you're
Yeah.
talking about. Did I go through that? Well, maybe I did. Oh, and it can be heartbreaking to watch. How do you deal with that on a personal level?
You know, you mean within this circle or within just
Yeah,
me
yeah,
myself?
when you see people like as you just described, kind of realize that they might have been assimilating or code switching, not fully truly being themselves when they didn't realize, and
Right.
and you cause that because you brought up the topic, right? How do you deal with that on a personal level? I'm just interested for me.
Oh, no, no, absolutely. So one within the circle, and I do call it a circle, I use a restorative circle model. So we
Mm.
literally sit in a circle with chairs. When that comes up, I'm very aware of when that realization is happening. And
Mm.
so sometimes it will bring up tears. And so I never want people, and I know I can't control it, but I never want people to feel raw or at least that it's been not acknowledged what just happened to them. So I
Mm.
always close the circle with this question and I say, okay, well, I know some things that we talked about that we brought up, kind of maybe it brought up some emotions that maybe you haven't thought about in a while. So
Mm.
how can you recenter or how can we recenter our joy before we
Yeah,
exit out of our circle?
love
That
that.
usually at least is a good acknowledgement and probably a big, and to answer your question, the personal part, that probably helps me as well because I don't want people to leave feeling raw. It's been acknowledged now in their life that this does exist or maybe this did happen. So how do
Mm.
we reset our joy? Helps me because it's heavy work, the work that you and I
Yeah,
do when we're talking about racial equity work, gender equity work. It is it is heavy. And
yeah.
so if we're not looking at active ways to recenter our joy, it does make it difficult to do the work that we do and to move forward from the things that we have to hear and an encounter.
Yeah, and so I've just picked up on another R there, which is recenter our joy. I like that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we always have like racial safeguarding information beforehand, so people have an idea of what they can do afterwards. But I like that in the moment, just bring that into the room, recentering your joy. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So can I ask, so what was it that made you feel like, you know what, I need to set up this organization now?
Yeah, I think there was so I mentioned a conference before we got on camera. A
Mm,
great friend of mine, Diana Farias Heinrich, beautiful woman in regards to the work that she's doing.
mm,
So we met at this conference. I presented at this conference before she did. So really my organization came as a result of like I wanted to legitimize the work that I was doing. So I was doing
mm.
these sessions. And so I said, I need to create an organization. Two things. I didn't want it to be named after myself. That's why I called it For the Hood, because I envisioned that it was people from the hood doing good, doing things for the hood. So from the hood,
And
for
again,
the
if I
hood.
can just jump in. So for those who don't know what the hood is, or da hood, could you just explain?
Yeah, so it's a business here in my community. I created it, so it's a small business, and we craft
No. I
organizational.
mean the actual word. So in England, this is
Oh,
not a
yes, yes.
terminology we use. So that is the, right? Hood, what's
Yeah,
that?
so it's a form of how do I say this? So it's letting people understand that this is our language. It's just a short word for the, but it's a stylized word. So for the hood. And I still
Well,
pronounce it the
what's the
same way.
hood bit? What's the hood bit? For the because there will be
Oh,
people who
the
are
hood,
listening
the
who don't
neighborhood.
get it.
That's
Yeah.
right. So in Spanish, neighborhoods is often described as barrios. So again, neighborhood or hood is just a shortened word of neighborhood. So
You know, that's so interesting.
for the neighborhood. Yep.
Because I don't know if that's been interpreted in that way. So I know the word hood because I used to watch a lot of Black American shows. And so I used to take that as a synonym for like a ethnic minority community. Is that what it means, or is it about any neighborhood?
It's the connotation is correct. What you said is that it
Okay.
usually describes black and brown communities.
Yeah.
So for the hood, but again, I leave it ambiguous because we need our white allies as well. So, but
Yes.
the focus obviously with my business is for black and brown neighborhoods
Got
and
it.
indigenous people as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would even expand it further. Any person of color who lives in America is really where my focus is.
Yeah.
I do some work with white allies, but
Mm.
my focus is absolutely in the hoods.
Okay. So you recently wrote on LinkedIn, most of my career in leadership, I felt, as you're laughing, as a man of color, I had to adapt to the room where it happens. These spaces have almost always been white spaces, and that's by design. Ain't no mistake in that. So, can you tell the listeners what your response was?
Yeah, coming into leadership, and I didn't notice it until you start, moving up. But in
Mm,
America, here's a stat that you should know: 83% of C level suites, so that's like the high positions,
yeah,
83% are occupied by white folks.
yeah.
That means only 17% are filled with people who look like me. And I was experiencing that the higher I got, whether it was direct or indirect. I never felt comfortable, and I didn't know it at the time, but certainly after I left this organization that I led as a CEO for this nonprofit, I started to reflect and I thought, wow. And so that is why, as you saw also my LinkedIn, my description is I strive to be as authentic as I can be in the spaces that I'm in, but it's hard. But that's literally why I knew any where the room where it happens was my voice really being heard, and more
Mm,
often than not, it felt like it wasn't. And so
yeah.
wanting to create spaces, wanting to create ascending leaders in color for those people behind me was super important. That was like I didn't want people to have to experience what I experienced.
So what I'm wondering, because again, I mean, some of the things come into my head as you say this. I think number one in the UK, I'm pretty sure the figure is a lot higher in the UK.
Wow.
So 13% is good by English standards. I'm sure it's in the 90s, the high 90s. The other thing I wanted to ask was, what's the percentage of ethnic minorities or Black and brown people in the US?
It's over 50%. I know, if you
Wow.
include all of the people of color, which is interesting. You used a term earlier, and I know we talked briefly about asset-based language. Like
Mm,
even minorities is it immediately conjures up certain groups.
yeah.
So one of the terms that's used now, and I don't use it a lot, but I try. It's called minoritized populations, and if you say
Yes.
that, it's really just basically saying, look, we're not even the minority. You put us all together, we actually are the majority in this country. And
Mhm.
so even simple shifts in language like that help. But yeah, I know it's over 50% if you include all people of color.
Wow. Ah, there's so much I want to ask you about. So that is interesting in itself because we're getting to a point in the UK where certain cities are becoming where Black and brown people are becoming the majority.
Yeah.
Minoritized populations, I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure how I feel about that because I think there's still a
Yeah.
bit in the language, the whole minority bit. A lot of what some people are using, which I think is common in the States, you can tell me, global majority. Is that being used
Oh,
there?
I've heard that. Yes, I've heard
Yeah.
that. Yes.
So the global majority is being used more and more, which I'm kind of leaning towards. But oh my gosh, I think I've forgotten a point. But you bring me nicely onto the concept of asset framing. So again, I was looking through your LinkedIn page and I came across somebody apologizing because they'd used a word. I can't remember what the word was, and you can explain in a moment. And then you or somebody introduces this idea of asset framing. And I was like, oh my gosh, why have I never heard this phrase before? But it makes so much sense. So can you just explain what that's about?
Yeah. So I can't take credit for the and so I say asset based, but there's a gentleman, Trabian Shorter's African American in our country who coined the phrase asset framing.
Mm,
But basically, what it is really just re-looking at words that we use and now have created a narrative or a connotation over time. And this happens a lot in nonprofits. So I'll give you the best example is an
mm,
at-risk student. So
mm.
when here in America at risk, the image that comes up is black or brown student.
Yeah.
And it doesn't showcase that this it's not that the student is at risk. And again, we make these connotations in our brain, these little those little fireballs that all those
Mm.
little whatever I can't remember, I can't think of the word. So anyways, so
I know what you mean.
yeah, so basically
Nerves and all that. I
the
can't remember.
synapses or
Yes.
the little neuro things, yes. So anyway, because our brain makes those connections, we're not, and because we've framed the word that way, that phrase, at risk youth, we're not we're not leading with one, the students' aspirations, but two, that the systems that were created to keep them oppressed, that acknowledgement has to happen. So you can literally say something instead of at-risk youth. You can say a black student who's striving as a student to get into such and such things, or talk about the community she's from, saying a black student trying to achieve success in a space where that has been historically under-resourced.
I
So it
love
just
that.
gives more context to
Yeah.
what that student situation is. And so
Yes.
I love using asset-based language because it does lead. And I will add this as well, because I often get some pushback from some people. They're like, well, how can I describe the problem then if I'm only using asset-based language? And it's like, nobody's saying to stop using that language, but it's
Mm,
the positioning. Lead
yeah.
with the aspirations, talk about the oppression, the systems that have been oppressive. That paints a much more accurate picture of that student situation than just being lazy and saying
Mm.
at-risk student.
Do you think that also then applies to using collective terms such as ethnic minority? Because I get asked this all the time, and I know that when ideally you'd want to talk about the specific community you're talking about. So here you might want to talk
Yep.
about African Caribbeans or Chinese people or whatever it might be. But sometimes you do need to use the collective terms. And I know you're saying, you're not saying don't use those terms. But what alternative terms that are more asset-based could you use in a collective context?
Well, I think it's probably what you said a moment ago, global majority.
Good point.
One of the thing, minoritized populations. Again, these are populations that have been minoritized, even though
Mm,
they are, at least in America, more than 50%.
yeah,
Um, what I do, which just really ends up working, I use people of color, communities of color. If I'm talking about the collective, people
yeah.
of color, communities of color. I
Frank,
often
can I
use,
can I come in? Sorry, I'm gonna jump in on that one because that term, people of color, has been problematic here, and I'll tell you why. And we wonder why people of color in America use people of color sometimes because that statement tends to do is to make white the norm because we don't say people of no color. So I just wonder why that term's been settled on.
I don't know why. I think it's probably been just an evolution, just finding the right term. And that's the other thing I would say about asset-based language is what we're saying now may change, like in a year from now, 2 years
Mm,
from now, 5 years from now. But I would say for the majority of America, that to me is the most accurate description. These are communities of color, and so to me, it's a great use of a collective. But
mm,
again, not knowing the history of UK, I can kind of understand where some language might be, I would say, triggering. So I
yeah.
know it really doesn't even matter. Even if I say diversity and inclusion in America, and this has come up often a lot, is
Yeah.
that is those are trigger words for some
Yeah.
reason for white folks. And I
Yeah.
think it's because it's been in the lexicon for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
I tend to lead with equity and access,
Yeah.
because to me, for if I'm talking to a white person, if I lead that way and say,
Yeah.
hey, we're just trying to build equitable access for people of color to have the same opportunities, to equitable access to educational and employment opportunities. If I say that, people tend to listen a little bit more. And it's like, we just want to make
Yeah.
sure that they have the same opportunities. If I say
Yeah.
diverse, that's a trigger
Yeah.
word for many people in America.
And isn't it such a shame that we have to go around the houses, if you like, to have these open, honest conversations about essentially
It's
what is
very,
racism, you know?
it's very
Um,
difficult.
Yeah, yeah, because that's something that we contend with all the time is coming up with the right language so that people don't shut off. And yeah, I mean that's a whole other conversation. But listen, we've got to bring this to a close. So if people want to hear more or learn more about fatherhood, where can they go?
Oh, absolutely. It's the number four DAHOOD.com. You can see all of the work that I do there. What I would love, well, I guess I would love any questions, absolutely. But the Ascending Leaders in Color program is probably the program I'm most proud of. So please, by all means, go on the website, click on where it says services, and it'll say like Ascending Leaders in Color. You'll learn a lot
Mm,
more about the program, and that is what I'm really trying to bring to our community, not just
mm,
in America, but obviously now in the UK, of a
mm.
space where we can call our own and where we can simply be.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for speaking to me at 5 a.m. in
Beautiful.
the morning. I really
Thank you.
appreciate you, and hopefully you got your heater on. But no, I appreciate speaking with you, Frank. I always learn stuff from these conversations. I think what I'm taking away from you, sorry, is this idea of being able to somewhat be able to show up as your true your authentic self by being real, by being able to reconnect, by being able to reclaim and to recenter your joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for having me.
You're
And you're
welcome.
doing great work yourself. Love it.
Thank you.